Hey everyone, I've decided to make good on the comments that I made at the end of my non-spoiler review that I would make a video covering the ending and theories regarding Final Fantasy VII Remake. If you haven't seen my non-spoiler review, I suggest you check it out. I'll leave a link in the description. The purpose of this video is to discuss the ending, the actions of the Whispers, and popular theories and predictions that people, including myself, may have about the future of the Remake series. And I hope to deliver all this information in a succinct manner that is detailed but also not unreasonably long. I want this to be digestible not just for people who played the original games, but also for people who didn't as well. Also, I am aware that the Ultimania for Final Fantasy VII Remake is out now, and various people are in the process of translating important parts from it. I do discuss an important interview that comes from the Ultimania later in this video. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes of this particular video, I do want to take the opportunity to discuss things that I could not cover in my review, such as the ending, as I mentioned, because obviously it was a non-spoiler review and I couldn't just talk about it there. If you did watch my review, you probably remember a comment that I made about certain story aspects that I said might aggravate fans of the original game. And that isn't necessarily just the ending, though the ending was extremely ambiguous and asked more questions than it answered, and I don't blame anyone who found themselves a bit frustrated by it. I know a lot of people considered that ending to be a sign of things to come, an ill omen, I guess you could say, about the direction that the remake series might be going in, but considering the quality of the rest of the game, I am staying cautiously optimistic. That being said, there are of course far more ways that Square could fuck this up as opposed to stick the landing. Ending the remake of one of the most beloved games of all time by essentially looking at the player and telling them that things are going to change is a ballsy move, if not a completely, potentially misguided one. I don't necessarily agree with people who are assuming the worst and thinking that the direction of the remake series is going to lead down the road of severe Kingdom Hearts level of plot entanglement, but I can understand their wariness about it. I simply believe that it is too premature to start assuming the worst, and as of right now, complaining about events in the game that haven't happened yet is basically equivalent to just being mad at your own fanfiction. So if part 2 comes out and it's as bad as we all feared, then you're free to kick and scream as much as you want, and I'll probably join you. But until then, I'm going to hold on to just a little bit of hope that this will end up as good as I want it to be. Outside of the ending itself, I do feel that there was a little bit too much of a physical presence from Sephiroth. One of the things that made Sephiroth such a compelling and scary villain in the original game was the fact that he didn't appear very often. As a matter of fact, we didn't even know what he actually looked like throughout the entire Midgar portion of the original game. We never saw his face or his entire body until that first flashback sequence that we see in the village of Kalm after the gang escapes Midgar. Up until that point, the only thing that we saw of him was his giant sword in the back of Shinra's dead body. And I feel that the opportunity to recreate that sort of suspense was a little bit wasted by trying to put him into as many scenes as they reasonably could in Remake, though I understand why they did that because this is just part 1 of multiple games in a series, and they have to establish him as some sort of threat from the get-go, but I still do wish that they were a touch more delicate about it and a little bit more choosy about where he would appear and what he would do in those appearances. That more or less concludes my thoughts on story elements that I wasn't able to discuss in my non-spoiler review. Generally speaking, I am very content with the plot and the way it was presented in Remake, and I'm looking forward to more. Now that that's out of the way, let's get to what you probably came here to listen to, and that is explanations and plot theories and predictions. I have a pretty big list of talking points that I want to cover. I do have a general layout of what I want to discuss in what order, and the first thing I want to talk about right now is the Whispers. If you played the game, you've probably understood what the Whispers are by now, especially if you played the original Final Fantasy VII. You've probably seen people refer to them as anti-retcon ghosts, and that is not incorrect. As a matter of fact, it's pretty spot on. For those who haven't played the original Final Fantasy VII, basically the Whispers appear every single time the events of Remake threaten to deviate from the events of the original game. And they don't just show up in very obvious places that signify huge events either. They also show up in spots that are a lot more subtle, and even people who played the original game might not catch what specific events they were trying to ensure would still happen. I have a list of what I think is every major appearance from the Whispers in the entirety of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I'm going to compare those events to the same events in the original game, and I'm going to tell you why they appeared there. Now, their first appearance is in Chapter 2, and it's not any sort of isolated incident. It's actually related to Sephiroth's first appearance in the same chapter. As you may remember, he shows up while Cloud is on the way to board the train in order to escape the sector. Sephiroth shows up after a station collapses and leads Cloud down an alleyway that is essentially in the opposite direction of where he's supposed to go. And the reason why this is significant in relation to the first appearance of the Whispers is because Sephiroth's distraction is about to cause Cloud to be late for his initial introduction with Aerith on Loveless Street. When he finally arrives, he sees Aerith being surrounded by Whispers, but they're not attacking her, they're just simply trying to keep her in place. And they more or less disappear as soon as Aerith and Cloud notice each other. But they show up again a minute later in order to whisk Aerith away and force her to escape down an alley when Shinra soldiers show up to fight Cloud. In the original game, Cloud wasn't under any sort of threat of running late for this fateful meeting. He just escapes the reactor, he doesn't have any sort of vision caused by Sephiroth, and he makes it to Loveless Street on his own and meets Aerith there, who is not under any sort of distress. And they exchange only a couple of words before going their separate ways. And this is why the Whispers showed up the second time in order to help her leave, because their conversation was actually running a lot longer than it was supposed to go. Their second appearance was in Chapter 3, and it was extremely brief. After Cloud finally arrives at the Sector 7 slums and experiences his first premonition of future events, a few Whispers show up for just a moment to guide him down the street and lead him directly to 7th Heaven, possibly suggesting that he was wasting valuable time by talking to this random Midgar citizen. Or perhaps it was just a visual acknowledgement that Cloud was indeed having visions of the future and was at risk of deviating from planned events. Next is probably their biggest and most meaningful appearance so far, and that is when Cloud is kicked off the team for the Reactor 5 bombing, which absolutely never happens in the original game. And in order to correct this, the Whispers show up, cause chaos, and eventually injure Jessie, which causes her to be replaced by Cloud, which puts events back on the right track. Next is immediately after the events of the Reactor 5 bombing, and that is when Cloud falls from the plate and crashes into the Sector 5 church where he meets Aerith again. Now here, Cloud actually gets into a fight with Reno and beats him, which absolutely does not happen in the original game. In the original, Cloud simply takes Aerith and they immediately escape to the back of the church. They don't bother to resist at all. So with Cloud getting into a fight with Reno and, even worse, winning, the Whispers interfere and force them to get back on the path that they were supposed to be on, by forcefully dragging them into the back of the building and making them escape through the rooftops. Next is probably the Whispers' biggest interference in the entire game, and that is preventing Cloud, Tifa, and Barret from stopping the fall of the plate on the Sector 7 slums. And the reason why the plate needs to fall is because it more or less kicks off the rest of the story, specifically the part where Aerith gets taken by the Turks. But it's also a little bit more complicated than that because the Whispers seem to fail at some aspects of this battle. For example, Wedge is supposed to die by falling from the top. However, in Remake, he survives and is able to help evacuate a lot of the civilians living in the slums. The Whispers likely don't prevent this simply because they are probably just not omnipresent and are unable to be everywhere at once, and thus they decide to prioritize the falling of the plate instead. The Whisper's next major appearance is when the party is going through Hojo's labs in the Shinra building, where they show up and carry Hojo off right before he is about to reveal Cloud's true soldier origin far too early. Now, in-universe, the consequences of Hojo revealing these details at this point in the story would probably be drastic. Cloud would probably just shut off and cease to function, and the Whispers interfere to prevent this from happening. The next Whisper appearance came with a pretty big surprise for people who played the original game, and that was the moment where Bareth is stabbed and killed by Sephiroth in President Shinra's office. The Whispers begin to immediately revive him, while the others proceed to fight Genova Dreamweaver. And a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction to this little scene was to assume that it was just a fake-out death to cheaply draw out some sort of emotional response from the player, when in fact it was just a way to quickly and easily show off the Whisper's intention and purpose within the story. Their next major appearance after this was quite abrupt and really dark. While Barret, Aerith, and Red 13 are making their way down to ground level, Wedge watches them pass by in the elevator, and the Whispers immediately show up to prevent him from meeting up with them. And they seem to go so far as to even throw him either out of the building or down the elevator shaft in order to make up for the fact that he survived what was supposed to be a lethal fall from the top of the support pillar at the slums. Pretty fucked up. And finally, the Whisper's last major appearance before the final battle was the flashback that showed us the beginning of Zack's final stand. Whispers can be seen flying among the Shinra soldiers, suggesting that their presence there was to ensure that Zack dies. And finally, with the defeat of Whisper Harbinger, our main characters are free from the shackles of fate, suggesting that they can now deviate from the events of the original game however they please. So yeah, evidence that the Whispers are basically anti-retcon spirits is pretty overwhelming, if not completely obvious. I don't think anyone would disagree as to the nature of the Whispers in this regard. But now we're going to move on to something that probably could be contested a little bit more concretely, but probably not by much, and that is the theory that Sephiroth and Aerith are both aware of future events, or perhaps even the events of the original Final Fantasy VII. Now, there are a few guesses as to how Aerith would probably know, but for the most part, it is chalked up to her connection with the lifestream. Sephiroth, on the other hand, has one very specific theory that a lot of people seem to subscribe to, and I'll get to that in just a bit. But for now, let's talk about the evidence that may suggest that both of these characters do know what's going to happen to them. First off is the fact that Sephiroth seems to stall Cloud in order to prevent him from meeting Aerith, as I mentioned earlier. I don't think he would bother to do that if he didn't know what sort of consequences that Cloud and Aerith's meeting would have on his plans to devour the lifestream and become a god. In that same scene, Sephiroth tells Cloud to leave Midgar and live.
Cloud, run away. You have to leave. You have to live.
And that could suggest a desire to prevent Cloud from meeting Aerith, or perhaps Sephiroth just wants to expedite things and get Cloud to deliver the black materia to him faster. Sephiroth even interrupts Cloud's meeting with Aerith by stepping forward and taunting him, saying that he's incapable of saving anyone, including himself.
You are too weak to save anyone. Not even yourself.
Pretty interesting and foreboding words considering the person standing right next to him when he said that. Now, Aerith's side of this discussion is a little bit more flimsy, because some of the evidence that suggests that she might know of future events could just be circumstantial depending on how you look at it. For example, Aerith seems to act like she's known Cloud for a lot longer than she lets on, and is also quick to act familiar with Tifa and Marlene, but this could just be chalked up to her projecting Zack onto Cloud and just being very observant in her interactions with the other two. Yet that doesn't necessarily explain why she knew that Cloud was a mercenary before he ever mentioned the fact.
You don't mind, do you? Bodyguard work's not too different from merc stuff, right? I guessed. From the sword.
In a short interaction with Wedge in Chapter 12, she also seems to act like she knows for a fact that nothing will be able to stop the plate from falling.
Don't give up hope yet. We could still save a lot of lives.
You don't think we're gonna stop them from dropping the plate, do you?
But again, that could just be her reading the situation in a specific way. Now the next two pieces of evidence are a bit stronger, and first is the affinity scene that you unlock in Chapter 14 if you gain enough affection points from all the various choices that you make throughout the game. I could probably dissect this scene for a little bit longer than I need to, but the one specific line that you need to pay attention to is Aerith explicitly telling Cloud to not fall in love with her.
And the memories. You've made me more happy than you know. And I'll always cherish what you've given me. But whatever happens, you can't fall in love with me. Even if you think you have, it's not real.
Now again, this could mean several different things, including her possibly projecting Zack onto Cloud, as I mentioned earlier. But she states that if Cloud falls in love with her, it won't be real, which could mean that she knows about Cloud's trauma and the fact that Zack is dead, which could all be affecting his perception of her. Either way, I don't think she would say something like that if she didn't know for sure that their relationship would end in some sort of tragic way. And the second piece of evidence is the fact that Red 13 found out about the nature of the Whispers after Aerith touched him.
When Aerith reached out to me, I found this knowledge of the Whispers.
This is without a doubt the most straightforward piece of evidence that we have that would suggest that Aerith knows more than she's letting on. This pretty much concludes all of the talking points that I have that support the idea that Aerith knows about future events. Sephiroth's side of this discussion is a lot more complicated, as I said before, and I will elaborate on that in just a minute. For now, I have a couple of small details that I want to touch on relating to the very ending of the game, specifically one small scene that happens during the series of final battles, and a few scenes that play right before the credits start to roll. First is a vision that the main characters have while fighting the Whisper Harbinger. Specifically the vision of 500 years in the future where Red 13 is seen running with his cubs and standing at a cliff overlooking the ruined and abandoned Midgar. Now the footage itself that was used for this vision is ripped from Advent Children, but the events depicted in this vision is considered canon because in the original game, this future vision is shown after the credits are finished. But curiously, Red 13 refers to this vision as something that will happen if they fail. And this tiny detail is interesting because, well, does it imply that the ending of the original game is some sort of bad end? Can it be avoided by somehow doing things better or in a different way? Or maybe that was just strictly a guess on Red 13's part. Next is likely the biggest bombshell in the ending cutscenes, and that is the fact that Zack survives his final stand against the Shinra soldiers. And if you've played the original game, or even played Crisis Core, you know for a fact that this is not supposed to happen. But interestingly enough, not only does he survive, but he also seems to survive in some sort of alternate timeline, as evidenced by the stamp that was shown on an empty chip bag, which showed that the mascot in this particular cutscene is not the same breed that Stamp is in the normal story. This is almost certainly the biggest contributor to the Kingdom Hearts comparisons, because there's no easier way to convolute your story than to introduce some sort of multiple timeline fuckery. Shortly after this was another big reveal, and that is the fact that Biggs is still alive and recuperating in the Sector 5 slums orphanage. Sitting on the table next to him are gloves that a lot of people seem to be convinced are Jessie's. And they very well could be, but it's not as explicit as placing her in front of the camera as they did with Biggs. And then finally is the short little teaser line that we get literally right before the end credits begin rolling. The unknown journey will continue. A pretty interesting choice of words considering the fact that this journey should be far from unknown for a lot of players. So this could be a sign of major changes that are incoming, or perhaps just Nomura being facetious, or tongue-in-cheek. We're gonna have to wait anywhere from 2 to 4 years before we find out. Now I'm going to touch on something that comes straight out of the horse's mouths. As you might know, the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania has been released in Japan. Unfortunately, there's still a bit of a wait before it's out in the West, but thankfully we have a few saints who are willing to translate some of the more important details of that book. If you don't know what an Ultimania is, it is essentially a series of books that contain art, developer notes, and interviews, and details about the world and characters and plot of every Final Fantasy game. Essentially encyclopedias. There are a couple of volumes that are officially translated and out in the West, but I think they stopped at Final Fantasy IX. I'm not completely sure on that, so don't quote me on it. However, in the case of the brand spanking new remake Ultimania, an interview with director Tetsuya Nomura, producer Yoshinori Kitase, and scenario writer Kazushige Nojima has been translated by a kind woman named Audrey, and I will put a link in the description to her Twitter post that will also direct you to her blog post on Tumblr that contains the full translated interview. Now, I'm not going to cover the entire interview in this one video because frankly it is a hell of a read, but I am going to touch on a few specific and big details that might clue us in on the direction of the remake story. First is Nomura very brazenly admitting that the word remake in the game's title actually does have two meanings. The first meaning is the simple fact that he wanted people to know for certain that this was a remake of the original game, as opposed to a spin-off or perhaps even just a movie. As for the second meaning, however, in true Nomura fashion, he laughs it off and says to ask him again in a few years. The next point pertains to Aerith specifically. The interviewer remarks that while playing through the game, her lines left a specific impression. And Nojima, the scenario writer, goes out of his way to say that Aerith is the utmost important person in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that he was extremely careful when writing her lines. Funnily enough, this is probably the biggest piece of evidence in support of the idea that Aerith knows about future events. The third point that I want to bring up from this interview is the revelation that Final Fantasy VII Remake was originally going to be part of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII media. And for those who don't know, compilation of Final Fantasy VII is essentially a collection of prequel and sequel content, including the mobile game Before Crisis, the PSP game Crisis Core, the PS2 game Dirge of Cerberus, and the movie Advent Children. So the fact that this supposed remake was going to be included among those things probably says a lot about the direction that the story is going to go. And speaking of sequels, let's finally begin the discussion on the popular theories and predictions that people are talking about. Far and away the most popular theory at the moment revolves around Sephiroth. A lot of people feel that the Sephiroth that we see in Remake comes from the future, specifically a post-Advent Children timeline. This will probably seem confusing or far-fetched to people who only played Remake, but if you also played the original game and watched Advent Children, you'll likely detect some of the threads that suggest this. The first couple of clues are music-related, and to say that music in Final Fantasy is extremely important is probably still understating it, as the music is probably the biggest contributor to the franchise's popularity outside of its characters. The first piece of music that you'll want to pay attention to is immediately after Sephiroth's first appearance in Chapter 2, where he distracts Cloud and guides him into a nearby alley. After he disappears and the player regains control, background music begins to play, and it is actually a new arrangement of a track called The Promised Land, which was featured first in Advent Children. Now, the concept of the Promised Land is an important plot device that is relevant throughout the entire story of Final Fantasy VII, but the fact that they chose a piece that was from Advent Children could mean something greater. The second piece of music that you'll want to take notice of is the song that plays during the fight with the Whisper Harbinger, which is titled Arbiter of Fate Advent, which could seem like a coincidence at first until you decide to use Assess on the three colored whispers that you fight throughout the sequence, and discover that they are representatives of beings from the future who want to protect the timeline that made them. Pretty interesting. The next set of clues is significantly more obvious, and that is the fact that Advent Children clips are straight up used throughout parts of the story representing visions of the future, including Aerith's death, the final battle with Sephiroth, and the vision of Red 13 500 years in the future, as mentioned before. Of course, this could just be a convenience thing because Advent Children is the only piece of Final Fantasy VII related media that is on the same level of graphical fidelity as Remake. But again, like the music, it could mean something more than that. The next clue comes directly from Sephiroth, specifically something that he says during the final battle. Before he performs the move Heartless Angel, he asks Cloud, "Shall I give you despair?" This is a word-for-word repetition of the exact same line that he said to Cloud at the end of Advent Children. It's a bit more difficult to dismiss this one as just a coincidence. The final clue is fairly significant, especially if you remember the last duel between Cloud and Sephiroth at the end of the original game. I'm not talking about the battle with Safer Sephiroth, I'm talking about the scripted battle after that you will always win no matter what you do in that fight. There are a lot of parallels between that fight and the short cutscene duel that Cloud and Sephiroth have at the end of Remake, especially when they take their signature stances and the camera smash cuts back and forth between them very dramatically. Now, all of these potential clues combined with the fact that Sephiroth seems to know about future events seem to suggest that he is indeed from some sort of future post-Advent Children timeline. Now, how he managed to come back in time, I have absolutely no idea. Maybe he manipulated the livestream, maybe his Genova Cell buffs are just broken bullshit that allow him to do this. Your guess is as good as mine, and we're gonna have to wait a few years before we can find out. But now that Sephiroth is out of the way, let's talk about other theories and discussions that people have been having. A popular one is how the Whispers reveal themselves. A lot of people assume that the Whispers show themselves to people after they're touched by Aerith physically. Another guess is that they show up to people who have been around or interacted with the flower that Aerith gives Cloud at the beginning of the game. Personally, I don't think there's anything complicated about it. I think they simply show themselves to people who are about to deviate from the events of the original game. What is probably the biggest discussion about the future of the Remake series is Aerith's fate. Is she going to die in the same way? Is she going to die at all? If Sephiroth is indeed from the future and wants to ensure that his plan succeeds, wouldn't it be a better idea for him to avoid killing her entirely? Because it is very arguable that it is her death that serves as the first step towards his demise. However, one thing is for certain, and that's the fact that Aerith's death serves as both the emotional and narrative heart of the story of Final Fantasy VII. If Nomura and crew want to keep her alive, then they're gonna have to do some serious finessing if they don't want to damage the story because of it. Aerith's fate could have something to do with the fact that a second timeline exists now, the one where Zack stays alive. The second timeline could just be a red herring that has nothing to do with the main timeline, or perhaps it could serve the purpose in proving that regardless of how many timelines you make, some things remain constant. That regardless of how many alternate realities may exist, Aerith will always have to die in order to defeat Sephiroth. But of course, that's just my guess. I think it's a pretty safe assumption that they're gonna want to do something that'll make Aerith's death a lot sadder this time around. Especially for people who have witnessed that scene 100 times by now, or for new players who think they know what's gonna happen. This next theory I'm only going to touch on for a little bit because honestly there's enough material in this one to justify making an entirely new video about it, but I'm just going to leave that up to the people who are willing to put the work in. Now, credit where credit is due, I first heard of this theory from Maximilian, who in turn said that he heard this from one of his own friends. If you keep up with his content, especially his streams, you probably know what I'm talking about already, and that is the 3 colored whispers that you fight in the final sequence of battles at the end of Remake. A lot of people assumed initially that those 3 whispers represented future versions of Cloud, Tifa, and Barret. However, if you keep an eye on their weapons of choice, their associated elements, and their attacks, as well as the information that you get from assessing them, there's actually quite a bit of evidence that suggests that they're not phantoms of future Cloud, Tifa, and Barret at all. They actually could be the Advent Children, Yazoo, Laz, and Kadaj. I know that sounds extremely far-fetched, but honestly, the evidence is there, and it is shockingly overwhelming. I would be completely and utterly shocked and dumbfounded if it was just a coincidence. And the final prediction that I want to touch on is the potential title of the next game. I've seen a lot of people discuss this, and it seems that the general consensus is that Part 2 of the Remake series will not be titled Remake Part 2 at all. It'll probably be given a brand new subtitle, such as Reunion. It's not a particularly big prediction or anything, but it's just a fun little tidbit that might be worth discussing. And that pretty much concludes everything that I wanted to cover in this video. I know I didn't go super in-depth in anything in particular, but I wanted to keep this as succinct and digestible as possible. Enough so that people who didn't play the original and are experiencing this story for the first time by playing Remake would also understand. I hope this was a detailed and satisfying enough video for you, and I don't think if I'll make another Final Fantasy VII Remake related video after this, as I've pretty much said everything that I wanted to say, but who knows. After completing Remake, I actually went back and played original Final Fantasy VII, as well as Final Fantasy VIII and IX, so maybe I'll make a video discussing those. Anyways, thank you for watching. Once again, if you didn't watch my spoiler-free review, feel free to check it out, and I'll see you around.